Day 10, downtown Toronto. Rain. I awoke to the sounds of raindrops on my window. A slight drizzle had encompassed Toronto in this midsummer morning. I gathered myself, slowly and groggily, as I felt a slight lump in my throat. Was I getting sick? I certainly didn't feel as energetic as I normally did. Nevertheless, I was excited as I planned for another jaunt into downtown Toronto. Coming from Canada's west coast, I had no issues dealing with the rain. After my morning cleansing ritual, I fired up my beast and off I went. I took the Gardiner Expressway into downtown. I was merrily driving along when a Ford Thunderbird made an illegal turn left in front of a Chevy Silverado. The truck wasn't able to stop in time and hit the car. After yelling out a few profanities, I pulled over to make sure that everyone was all right. After exchanging information, I hopped back into my beast and drove further into downtown. I decided I would stop into Chinatown again for breakfast. I parked on Spadina and walked around in the rain looking for something that would interest me. I found a nice little restaurant where I could sit at the window, looking at the Toronto street scene outside. Toronto, despite the rain, was bustling with activity. Like a scene from Winnipeg during the winter or Vancouver during the spring, everyone was unaffected by the outside environment. People had places to go and things to do. There was an intense energy about Toronto, an exhilarating rush no matter what the weather was like and no matter what the circumstances were. I felt like absorbing the energy the city was giving off. This was my first vacation in 3 years, and after being restricted due to the COVID-19 pandemic, I was going to enjoy every minute of it, be it good or bad. After finishing up my breakfast, I walked westward towards Little Tibet. While I was in this area yesterday, I didn't get a chance to fully explore. I have heard of this area many times in the media and through friends. Using Queen Street West as my route, I again passed through Trinity Bellwoods and Little Portugal. While Trinity Bellwoods seemed like a cool hangout for hipsters, Little Portugal seemed to offer more culture at the expense of cleanliness. Many Portuguese and Brazilian businesses line the streets, and football, or soccer for some of you, was celebrated everywhere. I immediately thought of how it would be so cool to explore these bars and clubs individually. But like most of my trip, I always felt rushed. Just as I arrived in Little Tibet, a downpour came from the sky to welcome me. I huddled underneath a covered entrance alongside a pretty girl and some odd character who seemed to be lost in the music of his headphones. Maybe there wasn't any music in his headphones to begin with. Regardless, I chatted up the pretty girl and came to realize how much friendlier Toronto is compared to Vancouver. Here were the three of us. Two, if you only count the ones that were sane, huddled in close quarters, sharing personal space while inviting small talk. This was definitely not Vancouver. I decided to hell with it and continued onwards regardless of the downpour. I welcomed the rain, soaking my hair, then my face, and down into my clothes. It was a nice change given that this has been a summer of wildfires and heat waves. After a few blocks, the rain slowed down to a mere mist and I could see the sky lightening up a little. I made my way to Roncesvalles, a neighborhood in Toronto I've never heard of before. I had quickly discovered that Roncesvalles was one of the largest Polish communities here in Canada. While Little Portugal was filthy, Little Tibet was a significant upgrade, and Roncesvalles was a well-organized and clean neighborhood. Gone were the overflowing rubbish bins in Little Tibet, and gone were the people fly-tipping in Little Portugal. I walked north through Roncesvalles, interested in viewing the Polish culture in this neighborhood. I passed by St. Vincent Church, seeing how religion helps tie the community together through worship. As I made my way north, the sun broke through the clouds, and slowly my body started to dry itself in the direct sunlight. While Roncesvalles was not nearly as busy with activity as the other neighborhoods I visited earlier, it was cool to see the people of Toronto going about their day while I had no care in the world. I reached Dundas Street, where I decided to head eastward back towards Spadina to my vehicle. Again, I passed through Little Portugal, Trinity Bellwoods, and then Chinatown before I stopped for a late lunch. I found a cute little sushi diner where I was able to relax and view the pictures I've taken over the past couple of days. My first day on my trip leaving Victoria, hang gliding with Terry and Dave on my second day, sprinting across the prairies and through Thunder Bay while nearly hitting oncoming traffic, and then my arrival in Toronto just days earlier. This was an experience that I have been waiting for so long. I spent a little bit longer at lunch than I expected, basking behind a window, watching the people outside. I was never one to people watch, but I've always been observant of my environment. Canada's largest city was worlds apart from the laid-back, small-town feel of Victoria. After eating far too much sushi, I decided to venture east of Spadina and explore the neighborhoods in that region. Now, taking Queen Street east, I sluggishly paced myself towards neighborhoods unknown to me. I enjoyed the spontaneous adventure I was experiencing, not planning anything in particular, but just walking around the streets of downtown Toronto. I passed by Toronto's old City Hall, reminding me of how much heritage there is on this side of Canada compared to the West Coast. Everywhere around me, in every direction, there was something that would catch my eye. I was taking in the experience of Toronto, and it felt surreal, like a wave of excitement washing over me and leaving me with an aura of adventure. I continued eastwards, passing through a neighborhood named Moss Park. From this point onward, I would experience the grittiness of Toronto streets. While I'm not at all unfamiliar with poverty or the street life, I certainly was not expecting myself to be in this area. While other neighborhoods west of Spadina were dirty and cluttered, Moss Park and the areas beyond were just filth. Individuals who were under the influence of some sort of narcotic, or those who possibly were lost in time and space, scattered the streets. It reminded me of Selkirk Avenue in Winnipeg. Some individuals were passed out on the street, prone with saliva pouring out of their mouths. Darkness was starting to set in. Surprisingly, I was in this area much later than I expected. The grit of Moss Park was soon replaced by the seediness of Cabbagetown. In most cities, businesses would open up in the morning. In Cabbagetown, the businesses seemed to start opening in the evening. However, the businesses in this neighborhood involved the distribution of controlled substances. I was approached by a few vendors offering their various goods. I kindly declined and continued onwards. No one seemed to bother me, despite the fact that I easily stood out as someone not from this area. I was shirtless, wearing a bright red cowboy hat, and carrying a large camera. As respect to the residents in this area, I didn't take any pictures, although there were many interesting things to be seen. I reached Parliament Street and decided to go north. I ended up walking through a neighborhood called Regent Park and into another neighborhood called St. Jamestown. By this time, the sun had disappeared beyond the horizon, and the looming residential towers stood before me. The streets were still busy, as it seemed like Toronto's activity never stops. The scene was similar to many I've seen throughout my travels. Several individuals yelling at each other, threatening physical violence at each other while onlookers laughed. Someone on a bicycle, far smaller than adult size, riding around looking for goods to take off someone's hands. Someone asleep on a park bench who urinated on himself during his nap. I ventured further until I reached the familiar Bloor Street, from which I decided to head westward towards Spadina again. When the grittiness, seediness, and poverty of the areas I just visited began to disappear, I found myself in a familiar area, back in Chinatown, and well past the expiry of my parking. I decided to have a quick dinner. Despite being quite late, there were still a few restaurants open. I took the first available seating, ordered something quick, and gobbled it down with no regard for my dining etiquette. Shortly after I paid my bill, I drove back to Etobicoke to call it a night. I slowly prepared my sleeping arrangements in my beast while reflecting on today's neighborhood exploration. I laid there with my eyes open, staring into the blank space of my headliner, thinking about what could be in store for me tomorrow. Toronto was truly a spectacular experience. Subscribe to the Travel Experience channel. Tap the bell and join the conversation in the comments section below.